Well, welcome to Realigning Security Resource Allocation for the Cloud. I'm your speaker, David Senf from Bell Canada, and I am the cybersecurity strategist there. I'm excited to bring you some of the content that we've got today. And what I'm going to try and do is take a very, very large topic and simplify it, boil it down into smaller chunks so that we can start to think about, as we move more of what we've got on-prem into cloud, and as we get deeper into more of a cloud-native world, what does that look like from a security control standpoint? What do we need to start to think about in terms of the skills and in terms of the tools and in terms of the budget allocation, right? Because we can already see that when we look at what Microsoft is saying and Google and the analyst world and that kind of thing, is that there's a lot of change coming, right? And some of them are pretty dramatic quotes when you look at that. And we can already see in Canada that the security spend in the cloud is now 23 cents on every dollar of a budget that's going out into the cloud. So that's an incredible shift in a short period of time. And by the time we get to 2025, according to the folk over at IDC, we're going to see 35% of that budget going to the cloud. So in other words, 35 cents on every dollar. Now, when we think about, well, where is that going, we'll start to map out what that looks like, and we'll start to map out where we're at and where we need to get to over time. Of course, your mileage may vary as these things go, and we want to think about it in your own context, but we'll provide you the tools to think about that today. And so we'll be looking at and thinking about, security from the cloud to the cloud, in the cloud and of the cloud. And of course, the whole from the cloud piece, we're well familiar, right? SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, the combination of secure web gateways, zero trust network access, cloud access security broker, and a number of other technologies that Gartner has combined together into the SASE space. And that's really where a lot of the spend is going today. And then we've got the of and the in the cloud. So the of, which is our CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management, and then the in the cloud, which is our cloud workload protection platform. Now, CSPM, of course, is just the guardrails that we're using to make sure that configuration drift isn't too far from what we anticipate. And, the basic things like I haven't exposed a storage bucket to the public internet, those kinds of challenges that we can run into. Now, of course, cloud is much bigger. Cloud controls and security is much bigger than just SASE and CWPP and CSPM. And by the way, CWPP and CSPM combine to make CNAP. You'll be hearing a lot more about SASE and CNAP as we get deeper into cloud-native application protection platform. But again, it's much bigger than that, right? Those are some of the key solutions that we hear a lot about today that are getting heavily promoted. But again, it's about certainly much more than that when we're looking at a cloud-based environment. So when we start to think about where is it that we're heading, well, and where I'm gathering this information from. So first of all, there's the intelligence that we have within our groups. We've got about 700 people on our security team working with our customers, talking about cloud security and that kind of thing. But we also work a lot with our vendor partners and look at their reports and that kind of thing. And we talk a lot with the analysts, the Gartners and Forresters and IDCs and 451s of the world and gather intel from them too. And so we bring that together and try and quantify where we're at and where ultimately we're going to, right? And that's not an easy thing to do necessarily, because cloud itself fundamentally is going to look different over time, and it's going to get far more embedded within our physical world, right? So imagine, little clouds everywhere, cloud in your backyard, if you will. So you've got a drone flying around, and that drone is offloading all of its compute capability to the cloud so that, its computer vision is much stronger than it would have been. And oh, by the way, I haven't eaten the battery by taking out that processing, capability. Or something maybe more practical that we'll use in our daily lives, which is augmented reality, walking down the street, looking at which restaurants I want to go into and that kind of thing. Well, that's going to be clouds that are really local to where we are. So it's getting far more embedded within our physical world. It's getting embedded within the business world increasingly as we get to this verticalized cloud. And basically, it's getting more democratized as we see low code, no code being pushed further. And what's the point of all that is that when we look at cloud and we look at cloud security, we need to be thinking about the different aspects of the broader picture and then how those pieces all fit together as we move forward. right? And so one of the things, of course, is that there's just a lot more, right? Cloud just means that there's going to be a lot more APIs, a lot more identities, a lot more things that we'll need to be looking at. And then as well, when we look at ultimately where we're going to be going to, we've got this hybrid environment today, right? And so we're looking at our pets, and we love our pets, and we take care of those applications. And then over time, we're going to be moving increasingly over into more of this multi-cloud world, which, you know, some of you are already pretty deep into. And that's when we get into our cattle, of course. We've been talking about that for many years. And eventually we're going to get into more of this distributed cloud. And so clouds again everywhere. And I don't know if we start to call those microbes or what we're going to call that, but so that's part of the problem. We just have more of everything. And so a lot more connections, a lot more possibilities for data loss and for exposed credentials and that kind of thing. At the same time, in Canada, we're seeing this uptick in, you know, movement of applications into an IaaS environment, and a lot of that still lift and shift, but we are seeing that move into cloud native as well. And that's really good because it means that we're starting to think about cloud, not just as yet another computer or it's somebody else's computer, but it's somewhere that I can do things differently than I have before. And that's important when we think about security, because it does afford us some really interesting abilities to change how we do things in a public cloud environment. We also have a lot of different vendors we're going to be, you know, distributing our applications across, and just interconnections between everything and everything else as we move into a cloud environment. So when we start to look at the problem set and really start to think about how do we break this apart into something a little bit more simple, because there's so many different variables. How do we boil this down? Well, funny thing, a fellow by the name of Sunil Yu, while he was at Bank of America, he's now at actually one of the sponsors here, Jupiter One. He put together this really simple 5x5 matrix, but from simple things come really good things. And what he's done is put the cybersecurity framework along the top of identify my assets, protect them with things like, you know, firewalls, identity, user training, detect and monitor that, you know, 24/7 ideally of what's happening in that environment, and gathering as much data as possible, containing the threat, containing what's any bad things that happen, and ultimately recovering as quickly as possible. And by the way, in Canada, we're pretty slow at recovery. We don't do a great job there. So those are our columns, and then those intersect with the things that we're trying to defend, right? Our devices, applications, network data, and our users. And we can start to look at is, where are we invested today? Where do we want to invest moving forward? And do those investments make sense? Are those investments that are going to be paying off over time? You can measure that and you can quantify that. So let's start with that. We can look at, this is the list from Gartner of their, the solutions that they track, everything from endpoint protection platform, EDR, all the way down the list. Now, if you take that and map that to this grid, you get something that looks like this. Now, there are percentages in behind this. I strip out the percentages for now. If you want them, please ping me afterwards. I'm happy to send those to you. The reason is that we get kind of bogged down in, well, why is that 15.2%, et cetera? What we want to do is, remember, we're trying to take a bird's eye view and then zoom in. But what I will say is that under the protect function, that's getting near to, you know, 55+% of our spend overall. So the majority of our spend is going into the protect function. A lot less into detect and respond, and as you can see, very little in recovery. And identify looks actually a little bit higher than it is based on the coloration, but it's a small percentage of the total spend in Canada today. Now, if we look at that by the things that we're trying to defend, what we'll find is the intersection of protect and network winds up being the area of the most spend today, right? So we're spending on firewalls, IDS, IDP type of devices. No big surprise there. And you might say, well, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's absolutely correct. Or maybe it's not, right? So we want to start to think about, again, what are these areas that we want to invest in, and what do we maybe want to change? And so studies like this, I find fascinating. This one was done by Scientia, presented by the folk over at Cisco, and they're looking at identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover in this CSF, and aligning that to the areas of success. And of course, the number one area that we're all going to care most about is, you know, the number of breaches that I suffer and how quickly can I respond. But there's also many other things. There's, you know, will the developers do what I ask them to do, right? Will my peers do, you know, or will I get vulnerabilities patched, right? Today, hopefully the vulnerabilities are being patched earlier on in the We're dealing with that earlier on and shifting left. But in any case, do I have a culture that's a clicky culture? And that's still going to be an important thing in the cloud. So what aligns most with that, as my mouse does its own thing, is identify. And what is identify? Of course, just for some of you, as a refresh, some of you I know, you're already well familiar with this, but identify, of course, is you're inventorying what you have. You're setting the priority order of how you're going to deploy your budget, how you're doing that based on the vulnerabilities and based on the threat modeling that you have. Okay. And so when we look at that and we look at the inventory that I have, this is an important area as we get into cloud. It's an important area even outside of cloud, to be honest. And CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, was that starting point, right? It allowed me to do some basic kind of discovery. The tools are advancing far beyond that, and there's a lot of interesting tools that'll help you be able to find the interdependencies between different applications and all those kinds of things so that you can see what's talking to what. So it's not just about I provide it credentials and it looks through my AWS or Azure or what have you environment, but more importantly, it'll go find things that are connecting to other things that I care about, right? And so that's important. Now, what's happening as well is that we're looking at not just identify, but detect as another core area. And in cloud, we really want to be connecting these pieces together, just like we do on-prem. Maybe you talk to the folk at, Matr, so, the Matr attack framework, they'll talk about, how look at the techniques that you're not doing well in, look at your purple team exercises and try and bring that back to identify where you need to pick things up. Or the NIST cybersecurity framework, similarly, they'll talk about, not just the core elements of it, but how do I integrate risk into what I'm doing? And that's really about bringing detect and bringing identify together. So those are two important areas to think about, which are, yes, both left and right of boom. And when we think about setting up our own risk posture, again, your mileage may vary where you want to put your attention. So when we talk about identify, we really do want to focus there for several reasons. One is that, as we look at applications moving from traditional monolithic applications to more of this microservice-based, and then to functions, of course, now we have more things that we need to identify over time. But the good news about cloud is it affords us so many abilities to get visibility into those environments and ability to secure ourselves in different ways. So when we look, as we start to move in this direction, and yes, we have more of everything, but we also get more ephemeral in those assets as well. And that's a great thing because it reduces the potential persistence of an attacker overall within our environment. So, for all of these things that have minuses, they also have plus sides to them when we look at what's happening in a cloud environment. At the same time, when we think about, well, was that investment on the network side ultimately what we should be doing? And when we think about, as we move, say, into SASE, and we look at, what the folk at Gartner and others are saying is that what we are moving into a world of is more network plus security engineering. And so it's not network on its own and network hardware and security, but we're bringing those together. Network, I know we've been talking about going software-defined network for a long time, but now we're definitely getting, much closer to that being a reality. In many cases it is. And we see that combining together to allow us to describe what the quality of services that we want for our users wherever they are. And instead of service chaining all these different security components together, is that we're bringing that stack into the cloud-based environment. And some of you, I know you've curated your environment and you've got all the best solutions for DLP and for CASB and for ZTNA, et cetera. But ultimately, what we do want to try and do is reduce the number of vendors that we have. So and I know that can be a struggle for some to kind of wrap their head around. It's like, how do I trust in a smaller number of vendors overall? But the point is that what's happening in terms of the network is moving up in terms of how we're going to manage that. And so some of the traditional type of controls wind up diminishing in importance overall as we start to move forward. We can also look at success, not just in terms of the NIST CSF, but we can also look at success in terms of technology areas that organizations have improved upon, and does that map to them doing better from a security standpoint? And paying down technical debt is one of the key areas. And again, if we're going cloud native out of the box, that's ostensibly what we're doing, is reducing technical debt. And we're getting closer to this kind of real-time refresh of our technology. This one here around integration, it's so important when we talk about orchestration, automation, and response. And I know we've all struggled on-prem to bring together our solutions, to integrate those solutions together. The great news about cloud is that it makes it much easier for us to get the visibility that we would like to be able to get. And we need to take advantage of that, because in a cloud-based environment, we still need our people to be having a look into what's happening. And that's exactly where we're going next. Coming back to our grid, we've talked a little bit about the technology, and we'll definitely go a little bit deeper into these areas. But what we see is that as we start to go, again, right of boom, bad things happening, we want to be focusing on our people. And our people need data. Our people need analytics. Our people need to be able to have that visibility. Now, this isn't necessarily about everyone becoming a threat hunter. In fact, I know there's a number of organizations watching online today and in replay who, frankly, are never going to have threat hunters, and that's absolutely fine, right? The fact that you don't, that you don't have that capability, again, what you want to do at least, though, is have the detection capability to know what's happening within that environment. Now, it becomes a bit of a gray, fuzzy area. What's my, tier 2 analyst versus what's my threat hunter, and on it goes. But the point is, cloud, again, affords us that ability to allow our people to do more. But we do want to focus there, right? As much as we talk about automation in the cloud, we also at the same time want to talk about people. Okay. Now, we also want to look at this from our attacker's point of view. So the volume of attacks is going to continue to increase over time. And that's when we talk about identify, right? Knowing what are the things that we have. The velocity of attacks are going to continue to increase as well. And so what do we talk about there? Well, we talk about, reducing the blast radius of an attack. And there's a range of things. Of course, the core tenets of zero trust, least privileges, and those sorts of things are critical for that as well. And then when we come to the variety of attacks, and so new techniques getting added into Matr attack and that kind of thing, that's when we get into our people, right? Our people are those who are going to understand what's different, what's odd, what's not quite going right on our network, or rather within an application environment. So I've got a sidecar running in a Kubernetes cluster that's from one of the cloud workload protection platform vendors. It's telling me that something's not quite going right. Well, to a degree, over time, there's going to be AI capabilities or ML++ that's going to allow me to to root out and take care of some of those behavioral anomalies. But we still need the people that really understand, well, okay, when can you go in and turn things off and that sort of thing. So it does become people intensive there. And we expect a lot more attacks with maybe smaller ransoms, more attacks over time. And what the attackers are going to continue to do, especially when we look at a cloud environment and single sign-on being that it's the low-hanging fruit, or it's certainly the fruit that I want as an attacker, because that gives me inroads into so many other things. And so you can imagine that over time that credential abuse is going to be one of the core areas that we're going to want to look at. And again, that's also, we can automate that to some extent, but we want our people to be looking at that too. Okay, so let's come back to our grid and let's start to think about how things are changing. So what we want ultimately to do, and you can already see this in organizations that are really kind of cloud native and they've gone deeper. And I know it's hard to see based on the coloration, is that protect as a function needs to drop significantly, right? And so instead of it being at, say 55%, we might want to drop that into, the mid 30s or low 30s or what have you. It depends, right? It really depends on your organization and what you're doing. But and what picks up the slack is in detect and respond, and also in identify. And so what's happening is that we're moving from this area that we had the most amount of spend and distributing that spend out to these big 4 areas here under application, devices, under detect and respond, but also application under protect. So it's not that necessarily we need to ultimately always thinking about how do I reduce my spend left of boom, at least particularly in terms of protect. Identify, we do want to continue to pick that up, but it's how do I reallocate that spend as well? Even if you don't redistribute it, if you reallocate and start to think about how do I move the spend from my network layer up into the application layer, by the way, which we've been talking about for a couple of decades now, even in the on-prem world, is trying to push kind of up into that direction. But now in the cloud, again, we have to get there, and cloud gives us that ability to be able to do that. But we don't have the capabilities from a network standpoint to be able to get that visibility and just simply to have the control that we would like to have at that layer. We do have to go up the stack into areas like identity, looking at least privileges. So when we think about identity, we want to think about the big three areas, right? Access management, privileged access, and identity governance. Access management being our MFA, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, albeit a double-edged sword with single sign-on. Privileged access is rotating my passwords, password vaulting, least privileges, getting as few people access to that as possible. And then identity governance is your joiner, mover, leaver, right? Who's joined the group, who's moved, and have we dealt with deprovisioning those credentials as quickly as possible, and not just for users, but of course for our devices and for our applications and that kind of thing as well, especially as cloud goes deeper into our physical world, as cloud goes deeper into our business environment through verticalized clouds and that kind of thing, right? Okay, and again, like I mentioned, there's percentages in behind this. If you're thinking, I really want to kind of dig into this, remember, you can set it up as a matrix within your own organization, and I'm certainly happy to chat with you about that as well. So when we're thinking about the things that we need to do moving forward, right? Of course, the big three attack vectors, the initial point of entry into an organization, number one is just common exploits. And how do we deal with that? Well, we deal with that with vulnerability management as one of the controls, and many other controls on top of that, of course. Basic phishing attacks, number two on the list. Well, it depends which threat report you look at, but number two is phishing. And with phishing attacks, what are we going to do there? We're going to train our users and put in MFA and things like that. Those are going to remain important in the cloud. We're still going to see a lot of phishing attacks. In fact, if I was an attacker, I'd be increasing my desire again to get access from a single sign-on standpoint, so that I could get access, change your password, lock you out of that environment, and now I'll sell you your credentials back, as opposed to needing to encrypt any of your data. I can work that way. So look at that as a core threat model moving forward. And so when we think about credential abuse being one of the core areas that we're going to focus on, we really do have to enable MFA in everything that we do. We do need to see how our credentials are being used. So those are the big three areas. We continue to need to do that. And I'm not saying as well, when I was talking about network, that network security by any stretch goes away. We still need to have attention there. But what I did was we mapped out some of the other areas that you want to think about overall, right? Once you've done some of those basics, then we want to look at attack surface monitoring, attack surface management, bring those pieces together, right? So that I can have awareness of what's happening in my IaaS, PaaS, and across my SaaS-based environments. I do want to get into areas like zero trust as an organization. You want to get into, least privileges. We want to make sure that we're allowing only those in who have not just the proper credentials, but the behavior on the device and all those different kinds of elements. So we want to continue to focus there, and even getting into areas like microsegmentation. So I know I've been slagging the network and the focus there a little bit, but my intent is that what we want to start to think about is how we do that differently as well. So things, again, like dynamic microsegmentation and that sort of thing. I haven't talked a lot about the data, and yet the data is, other than the availability of solutions, is what ultimately we're trying to protect. So DLP in the cloud is much better, much easier than it was on-prem. In fact, there was a lot of pretty bad or failed enterprise DLP deployments in Canada. And a lot just kind of started to wade into it and said, I'm just going to pull back from this. The good news about cloud is that it makes it much easier for us to do DLP than we have. Now, DLP is the if all else fails, then DLP control. However, it's still a critical control, especially when we get into cloud. Remember, we don't have our firewall perimeter anymore. We don't have any of those kinds of advantages. So now we want to think about, how do we protect data before it leaves the organization? We want to be focusing in on these big four areas as well. We want to think about the respond time that we have. We want to be very well practiced. Remember, when we come back to people, it's not necessarily you need a bunch of threat hunters, although to be honest, in some of the bigger organizations, the larger banks, telcos, government, they're going to have their complement of folk who have the resources to do that, and that's fantastic. So if you can do it, of course, by all means. But I think for everyone else, it's being very well practiced. I do know credentials are going to get abused. I do know that workers are going to get locked out of their of the environment. What do I do in that case, right? There's going to be all kinds of attacks we can start to anticipate as we start to do threat modeling in the cloud and versus cloud security and sort of figure out what that's going to look like. So encourage you to continue to practice that. Recovery is very interesting. So recovery is, as we get deeper into cloud, so coming back to Sunil Yu. So Sunil Yu, remember, he was the one who put together this matrix in the first place. He's got this really interesting talk, and I've linked to the talk down at the bottom in this down here. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. But he likes to talk about how the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability needs to DIE. CIA needs to die, which is distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And what he says is that, well, the availability of my system is to some degree improved by the distributed nature of cloud, right? I inherently get some, inherent DDoS capabilities from that. In terms of immutable, that helps me in terms of the integrity of my environment and that sort of thing. There's a number of other benefits that come with both this and this. And the ephemeral nature of a container, of a function, of those environments then also afford me the ability to be able to reduce the persistence of the attack. And when we think about action on objectives of, say, a ransomware attack, executives will often say, well, are we protected against that ransomware, against, Black Matr, or against the revisited Revol gang who's back? And really what we want to do is be thinking about far before that attack actually happened and be able to stop the persistence in the first place and all the other things that are happening from that point, which is the reconnaissance, lateral movement, et cetera, right? An ephemeral nature of the environment really helps us deal with that. So cloud native, again, has its inherent security capabilities and really helps us from that recovery standpoint. So as you start to move forward and look in your own organization, I would encourage you to think about, where are you at today? Take a look at the grid and consider, where would we put our chips? And you think about the child's game like Battleship and that kind of thing. It's almost kind of like going down that path. But as you can see, it would lead to all kinds of very interesting debates and think about, well, what do I want to transform towards? If I start to transform towards more of a cloud native world, what are the advantages that I get? And are we ready? Are our teams ready to be able to do that? Do we have the tools in place? Which squares are we less fulfilled in, and which areas do we need to do more in? Because again, in Canada, the amount of spend in cloud continues to grow quite significantly. And we just want to make sure that the allocation of those resources is as proper as possible. We want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the cloud really in the way that we can ultimately. And so I think it's really important that we, again, look at these kind of, albeit very, very simplistic models, but really powerful insofar as what they're doing as well. So with that, I'm going to offer my my information for you to follow up with. I'm very happy. I know I've went through a lot of information with you today. What I'm happy to do is to engage with you afterwards. So my email address is there, david.senf@bell.ca. My LinkedIn is there as well. Do feel free to connect. I'm very happy. I know I spoke very quickly. That was with intention because I wanted to get through a lot of material in a very short period of time, because then you have this tool to basically go back to, and you can go look at some of the other things that I've linked out to and some of the other areas that I've sourced in this deck as well. So with that, I thank you so much for your time. I thank the cyber tech and risk folk for the invitation to speak today. It's a great conference, lots of just fantastic talks and speakers. So thank you again for your time, and we'll deal with Q&A as we go into the chat sessions and offline as well. Thank you so much.